Hello, welcome to this video, and on this video I'm going to be going through the 10 greatest rock guitar gods of all time, and I'll be ranking them from 10 to 1, right? So what do we mean by a rock god guitarist, right? So the criteria I'm using for this video is how great are they as a rock guitarist. So we're not looking at jazz guitarists, we're not looking at fusion guitarists or classical guitarists. We're looking at rock guitarists. And I think what makes a rock guitarist great is not only their technique and ability, but also a couple of other things. One of them is the part they play in the development of rock guitar, and more widely, the development of rock and metal as a genre. And also the charisma. You know, the idea of the rock guitar hero is something which is embedded in our culture now. We know exactly what we mean when we say, you know, guitar hero. You know, there's a computer games called that. It's a very specific thing. It's to do with the stance, the shape. It's to do with the image, the charisma. It points to rebellion, but it also points to a sort of almost like a wizardy wisdom that these people would have. You know, they're mysterious. You know, they're like magicians. So many of the great rock guitar gods have played on that. They're outlandish. They're performers. You know, it's in their clothes. It's in the way they look. It's their hairstyles. The guitar they played. Some of these guitarists have made certain guitars famous. You know, so it's on those criteria that I've based this video. So I'm going to go straight in at number 10. So at number 10, I have Michael Schenker. All right. Me being of a certain age and coming to music through heavy rock and heavy metal, I cannot overstate the importance of the guitarist that we know as Michael Schenker. All right. I think when we're going through this video, you have to focus on certain guitarists, because I think they really represent these huge achievements in rock music in the 20th century. By the time we get to the 1980s, we have this sort of 80s heavy metal guitarist, and there's a huge explosion of these in the 1980s. It becomes a big thing. You know, your Joe Satriani's and your Steve Vai's and your Paul Gilbert's and Vinnie Moore's. And I actually want to do a video where I rank all those guys as well. There's a number of guitarists in the late 70s that provide a bridge from the sort of 70s classic rock guitarists to the 80s metal guitarists. I'm thinking of people like Randy Rhoads, Eddie Van Halen, Uli John Roth, to some extent the guitarists in Judas Priest I would put in there. The greatest of all those bridging guitarists for me is Michael Schenker. Michael Schenker started playing the guitar at a very young age, and by the time he was 10 or 11 years old, he was doing professional gigs. I think the reason for that is because his older brother was a guitarist, Rudolf Schenker, and Rudolf Schenker was a founding member of the rock metal band The Scorpions. Again, another really important band in the development going from heavy rock to heavy metal. I think Schenker debutes about 16 years old on the first Scorpions album, Lonesome Crow, and then he goes up and joins UFO. Now, UFO at that point are a sort of proggy, psychedelic, blues, jammy rock band, totally not what we know for them for now, and a pretty poor band as well. I don't like those first few albums. When Schenker joins at a very young age, he's just out of his teens really. He not only becomes the guitarist of UFO, but he also works on their album Phenomenon. Now, Phenomenon for me is a very, very important album, because UFO are a very, very important band. I would say one of the most important bridging bands, you know, one of the architects of what we know as heavy metal. They were also an absolutely fantastic rock band. You know, credible vocalists, great songs, and one of the great guitar heroes of all time in Schenker. I was a big fan of UFO. Their greatest album, of course, is the live album Strangers in the Night, which was recorded just before Schenker left. Michael Schenker seems to have been throughout his life a very difficult character. Still seems to be a very difficult character that seems to have left so many bands and fallen out with so many people. And just when UFO were poised to become perhaps one of the greatest rock bands of all time, equal to Led Zeppelin, Deep Purple, Iron Maiden, Schenker leaves. And Schenker had been a principal songwriter. So on the last tour he ever did, they recorded 6 shows. That came out as Strangers in the Night. Strangers in the Night for me is one of the greatest rock albums of all time, and on there is a track called Rock Bottom, which is 10 minutes, where Schenker just redefines rock guitar, and he is pulling in so many different things. A lot of it is from fusion. It's almost like modal improvisation. It suddenly opens out, probably harking back to what they UFO were doing on the first 2 albums, but with Schenker playing, absolute genius. His sort of legato-y, hammery, pull-off way of playing, that signature sound he has on the Flying V, and the way he looked with that Flying V, all of this is just so iconic. You know, in the early 80s, we have so many other guitarists playing, you know, Gibson Flying Vs. I'm pretty sure he played it. I think Rudolf Schenker played one as well. But he was so iconic. He was such a fantastic guitarist, and he really lays the groundwork for what's going to happen in the 80s in rock guitar. And so that's why I've placed him at number 10. Okay, so Schenker comes out. He spawns a whole host of guitarists in the 1980s. This really becomes a thing. Some of these guitarists are making instrumental albums, but these albums are selling in the millions. It's also driving rock and metal in the 1980s. In the 1980s, if you had a rock or metal band, you had to have a super sonic guitarist in there. You know, Razorhex would have Paul Gilbert, you know, Megadeth would have Martin Friedman, nearly forgot his name. You know, so there's all these great guitarists. There's so many really important guitarists we have to have on the list, but I want to represent all of those guitarists with one guitarist, and for me there is only one, and that's Steve Vai. Steve Vai is without a doubt one of the greatest technical 80s guitarists, but he's so much more than that as well. There's so many videos on this channel where I discuss Steve Vai, so if you want to go and check that out, you can see me discussing him. I think there's a whole video on Steve Vai. But I think it's a combination of his incredible virtuosity, but also his incredible compositional skills. Vai didn't just make instrumental guitar albums. His albums were about stuff. You know, it's like a soundtrack almost. And he did so many different things throughout the 80s and 90s and right up until now, you know, really pushing the envelope. But of course, Vai was also so iconic and such a great looking guy, you know, great hair, great clothes, incredible performer on stage. I've seen Vai many a times, but the first time I saw him it was at the Monsters of Rock Festival in 1988, where he played with David Lee Roth. And he was just all over that stage. And I can vividly remember at one point him just putting his arms out and then this sound shooting out the guitar like he hadn't even touched it. I can remember David Lee Roth dragging him around the stage by his hair. Absolutely incredible. He's the full package for me. He is the definition of a rock guitar player. And so this is why I've got Steve Vai at number 9. Right. At number 8, and I put him on because I've been doing a lot of videos about classic rock recently, and I haven't included The Who, and people have been saying, why didn't you include The Who? You know, you've got, you know, your greatest classic rock live albums, and you didn't put Live at Leeds on. I've just finished reading Roger Daltrey's biography, and he was pretty down on Live at Leeds. He didn't think it was that great a performance, and I think that may have coloured my opinion. I really love The Who, especially 60s Who. I lose interest around about Tommy and after. That's probably sacrilegious. But Pete Townshend is really one of the first guitar heroes. He's there before Hendrix. He's there before Jimmy Page. He's there before, you know, well, not so much Ritchie Blackmore. Ritchie Blackmore's around the 60s. He's really coming out, you know, at the same time as someone like Eric Clapton. And Eric Clapton does not make my list. I will talk about that in a minute. That's going to upset many people. But he doesn't make my list, and there's a reason for that. And I've got a strong reason for that. But Pete Townshend does, and the reason is because Pete Townshend is a really great innovator that has created a body of work that just goes on. You know, I'm a huge fan of the 60s stuff, but albums like, you know, Who's Next, Tommy, Quadrophenia, are also absolute classic albums. His sort of windmilling arm and his smashing instruments up on stage, which he did before Hendrix did, is also iconic. He's an iconic performer, without a doubt. But there's another reason why he gets on this list. Way before The Who, Pete Townshend was in a band with a drummer, and the drummer took drum lessons from a guy called Jim Marshall. And Jim Marshall decided to set a little shop where we'd sell drum stuff. And then he expanded out. He started to sell guitar stuff and amplifiers, and he was selling Vox AV30s and all that, which were really expensive. And he had the idea, you know, why don't I, you know, make my own amp, which is the Marshall amp. This is a British invention. Now, I have heard, and I don't know how true this is, that Pete Townshend, as a young guy, was influential in the development of that Marshall amp. He was the guy that said, make it a 100 watt amp, and he was the guy that says, and make it so when you turn the gain up, it distorts. What we definitely know is when The Who was out, 65, they were incredibly loud and they were playing through Marshall amps, and Townshend was responsible, very important guitarist, I think, in the development of that sound. And he takes that, and that's the beginning of rock guitar. It's the secret weapon that a lot of the British guitarists had in the 60s that American guitarists didn't. You know, we had the Marshall amplifier. We were exploring the heavy distorted sounds. Eric Clapton now will get his due. As a 17-year-old, or however old he was, in the early 60s, when he walked into the studio with the Blues Breakers, and he had a distorted sound, which he did so he could try and get those extended notes, so it would sound like more of a horn. You know, the sustain would allow him to play longer notes and bend them. And when the engineers turned around and said, you know, you can't play that distorted sound, and as a 17-year-old, he stood his ground and said, no, that's my sound, he changed rock guitar. And Clapton then went on with Cream to do some incredible things. My opinion is, after that, there is very little that Clapton did. Clapton gets a reputation, I think, because his guitar playing is quite conservative. For me, he's a backwards-looking player that is really just emulating people like Freddie King and B.B. King. Pete Townshend's not. Pete Townshend is a forward-thinking guitarist who's trying to push the form. He's definitely an architect of progressive rock. I don't think Tommy and Quadrophenia are progressive rock albums. I think they're rock operas. But he's want to extend the form, and I think really makes him an important, innovative guitarist who had an incredible image and fulfills all the criteria to be on this list. So that's who I have at number 8. And hopefully the Who fans are now pleased that I've been able to mention the Who, and you've discovered that they're not like a band I don't like. But you've also discovered I'm not so much a fan of Eric Clapton. I actually did a gig with Eric Clapton a few years ago. I supported him, and when he went on stage and played, I snuck down behind the stage, and I was literally behind the stage about 4 foot away from his amp, and I listened to him play, and it was astonishing. He never made this mistake, never made a mistake on the whole gig. It was just perfect guitar playing. But for me, has he done anything important musically after Cream? Maybe Derek of the Dominoes, I don't know. Or is that just famous because they had the hit off it? I don't know. He sort of turns into a middle-of-the-road artist for me for the rest of time. I have friends that absolutely adore his playing. I prefer a whole bunch of other blues guitarists that, for me, have more of a personal stamp. I've always been troubled with the idea of, you know, sort of white middle-class British people aping, you know, black American blues guitarists. If you're going to do it, you have to put your stamp on it, and some guitarists really do. And there's some guitarists on this list that I think have done and taken the form and taken it out. Clapton hasn't done that for me, so he's not on the list. Pete Townshend is. His way of playing is totally original, and it reflects the culture he comes from. He does not try and do blues guitarists. He tries to do something else. the way he slashes at the guitar just fits that busy John Entwistle bass playing, which is almost like the lead guitarist of the band, and then moves out of control, you know, fluctuating tempo drums. None of this should work, but you put those three elements together, and all you can do as a guitarist is just slash these chords across this sort of sea of bubbling, you know, energy. That is what the Who produced. They're a really unique band, really incredible. And so, have I said enough? I like the Who, they're incredible. And things like I Could See for Miles are just some of the greatest songs in rock history. I've said it there. So that's where I got Pete Townshend at number 8. Why is he so low? Because what we've got coming up as some of the most important guitarists in the history of music, not just rock guitar. So who do I have at number 7? I've got Tony Iommi, right? So what does Tony Iommi do for guitar playing? He basically invents heavy metal and heavy metal guitar playing. 1969 with the first Black Sabbath album. You know, Tony Iommi is a really interesting player for me. I'm very good friends with the drummer Bev Bevan. He's one of my best friends, and Bev's best friend is Tony Iommi. And Bev has been able to confirm to me something that I've always thought, that Tony Iommi is a much more subtle and versatile guitarist than he is known for. An excellent acoustic guitarist, fingerstyle guitarist, a guitarist who studies people like Django Reinhardt and can play in those types of styles, and a guitarist that's overcome adversity. We all know the famous story that where Tony Iommi lost his fingertips and he thought he would not be able to play, and he actually built out of, I think, washing up liquid bottles, false fingertips that he could put on. He had to drop the gauge of the strings so he could bend, and he had to play in some cases in a more simplified way, you know, using power chords. Very inspired by Django Reinhardt, another great guitarist who was physically impaired. Django only had the use of these two fingers on those. Not these ones, they're mine, but you know, he didn't have the use of my fingers. But he did have his own fingers, but only the two of them that worked. And he could use the other ones to put. I'm going off the subject now. You see, this happens with me. I've got to watch this. Should we get back onto Tony? Forget Django. He was an influence on Tony Iommi. That's the point. You would never expect that from somebody that's so known for being the Dark Prince of heavy metal. Sabbath, all the way through, created great albums. When so many rock bands in the 70s were done, you know, they changed singer and they should have gone away, but they pulled in one of the greatest rock singers of all time, Ronnie James Dio, and made 2 albums that are absolute masterpieces. You know, of course, Heaven and Hell, but also Mob Rules. Mob Rules is absolutely fantastic. In the 80s, they did Live Evil, which I think is one of the great live rock albums from the 80s. Nearly made my list. I absolutely love that album. You know, Tony Iommi has really been important. And that whole sort of satanic upside down cross, you know, the big black moustache and the darkness and all that sort of look. His look, I think, you know, with the name Iommi, I assume there's some Italian perhaps heritage there. I haven't researched this, but I assume that. And that look as well is we see crystallized in Tony Iommi. So that's who I've got at number 8. Number 7 is Tony Iommi. Is there a greater rock guitarist than Tony Iommi? Well, at number 6, I have Angus Young. Now, the reason why Angus has come so high on this list is because I just think Angus is so good, right? And I think he's underrated. Is he iconic? He's about as iconic as it gets. And he's iconic in a way that no other rock guitarist is iconic. All these other people on this list, they've got these shapes. They're cool, handsome with the long hair and the Gibson Flying V or whatever it is. Angus with his schoolboy outfit, mooning the audience with that Gibson XG that looks like it's twice the size because he's only a little fella, you know, and all that thing is so iconic. And anybody who watches a live video of AC/DC, it's astonishing. This guy is like a ball of energy, and it seems impossible that these perfect guitar lines can be coming out of a guitarist that seems to be absolutely out of control physically, right? And that's an astonishing thing. So often if you hear a live recording of a band, Even when they're not running around, they're struggling to make it sound like the record. Angus always plays perfect, right? I believe he is as great, if not a greater blues guitarist than Eric Clapton. And he plays perfect as well. But he's also carved out in his band, along with his brother Malcolm Young, what the definition of rock music is for me, right? And that definition is like nuclear physics, right? AC/DC can take 3 simple chords, right? But it can make those chords iconic, right? I'm going to sing, I ain't going to even sing the chord, I'm just going to sing 3 notes at the beginning of one of their songs now for you. So what's this? Ba-na-na. Now those who know AC/DC go, oh yeah, I know that song, it's just so iconic. You could sing that. How do you make that work? That's astonishing. His guitar playing's incredible. Anyone who checks out the live album, If You Want Blood, check out his blues playing on the Jack. It's absolutely incredible. And Angus forges his own biting blues playing. Yeah, he's really come out of Chuck Berry. He's one of those rock guitarists that goes back to the source. Many of these guitarists came out of Chuck Berry, of Scotty Moore, James Burton, you know, of all these rock and roll guitarists. So they were able to take that sound and forge rock music out of that. It's absolutely astonishing. And Angus is one of those. And for me, the definition of rock, heavy rock, and even heavy metal is AC/DC. I cannot tell you how much I love that band. Astonishing. The drum parts, the incredible vocals of Bon Scott, the incredible vocals of Brian Johnson, everything amped to the max, everything full blast, but just so artistic and creative. And there's subtlety in their music that if you study it, you will see. Really incredible. Right, so that's how I do at number 6 is Angus Young. Right, the guy that I had at number 5 is the guitarist that if you went back to a 14 or 15-year-old me and said, who's the greatest guitarist, I would have said this guy, right? And that is Ritchie Blackmore, all right? Ritchie Blackmore is, for me, coming up, was the great rock guitar player. As much as we love Jimmy Page, as much as we love Tony Iommi, of those classic rock bands, Ritchie Blackmore was the astonishing guitarist. And I think that's because Ritchie had a sound which combined sort of rock with classical, but in a way that was completely unlike the progressive rock musicians were doing it. He forges those ideas through Deep Purple. And he's just so iconic. He is the Man in Black, you know. It's a little bit of Hendrix and a little bit of Johnny Cash. That's what you get with Ritchie Blackmore. He's got a reputation where you feel he's difficult. You feel that he's going to cause trouble. And I like that. He's dangerous, you know, and a bit scary. And anyone who's watched Deep Purple California Jam, he loses his temper and he smashes a camera up. And then the next thing, the whole stage is on fire. I mean, this is what makes rock guitarists great. His lineage goes way back. He goes way back into the 60s. I think he's in a band called The Outlaws. And I wasn't planning on talking about this. So I'm really pulling this out of my head, off the top of my head. But I believe he worked with the producer that produced Telstar, Meek. Joe Meek. Is that it? Have I got that right? You'll be checking me out. I didn't expect to talk about that. That's just flooded in. I thought, yeah. Ritchie goes right back to the early 60s. He is of the era of Clapton and Page and Jeff Beck. And I think of those 60s guitarists, he does not get the recognition he should. He's an astonishing player. For me, it all comes together with Rainbow and Rainbow Rising, where it really lays the groundwork for what rock is going to be. It's sort of what heavy metal's going to become. What sort of the guitar, like Vin Mal's theme and Steve Vai, all that's in there. The neoclassical thing is in there, and even aspects of progressive rock are in there as well that we're going to see later on. I think in Iron Maiden and then Dream Theater. It's all there with Blackmore. Blackmore is such an iconic, important guitarist, and he really makes this list for just being so incredible. And then on top of that, in the late 70s, early 80s, he turns his hand to producing hit records. and with All Night Long and Since You Be Gone and I Surrender, Can't Happen Here, you know, came up with some really brilliant, you know, FM radio friendly songs, which I absolutely love. Absolutely brilliant. So that's who I've got. Number 5 is Ritchie Blackmore. Shall we move on? So we've got 4 guitarists here now. These are all pretty legendary. What am I going to say? What have I got? Number 4, I've got Jimmy Page. Do I have to explain why? You know, I've got whole videos on Led Zeppelin here, so I really feel I need to say something else about Jimmy Page. So I'm going to tell you let's talk about a specific thing. We all know he's incredible. We all know Led Zeppelin, probably the greatest rock band ever. I just said AC/DC were those two. He's like a dark magician, you know, black magic. He's into weird things, esoteric things. He's almost pulling these spells out, you know. There's so much going on with his playing. Incredible guitar solos, like the guitar solo of Stairway to Heaven is an incredible guitar solo, but he's also got these folk things and blues things. My hands have gone all like this now because that is what Jimmy Page, you know, this thing of here and the theremin and all that, it's all there with Jimmy Page. Jimmy Page is an interesting character. He's right there at the beginning of the development of rock music. He's one of those guitarists that's as a teenager, he's in the session scene in the early 60s. You can go back further than then. If you look on YouTube, you'll find a video of a very, very young Jimmy Page on television talking about his skiffle band. I think he was in and around London at the time, and there's a whole bunch of sort of BBC session guitarists, and they're working, and rock and roll's happened, and they're getting asked to do like Chuck Berry type solos. Now, the story that I have been told from a number of different places was one of those guitarists on that scene was John McLaughlin, the great John McLaughlin, who my channel is almost dedicated to. And he didn't want to do Chuck Berry type guitar solos, so people asked around and they said, well, there's this young kid that I know, why don't we bring him in? He's great at Chuck Berry guitar solos and that sort of rock and roll thing. And they brought Jimmy Page in as a very young guy, and he was sort of put under John McLaughlin's wing. And there is it's out there that apparently John McLaughlin gave lessons to Jimmy Page in the early 60s, you know, how to get through sessions and stuff like that. When I was playing with Robert Plant, I once mentioned this to Robert, and he said he wasn't aware of this whatsoever. But there's a great video now you can search out on YouTube with an interview with Dennis Chambers, where he's talking about being in a rehearsal room with John McLaughlin and Jimmy Page turning up at the rehearsals because he's trying some amps out and sort of saying to people, you've got to let me in to see John McLaughlin, this is my teacher, and this sort of story of him coming in and almost hero worshipping John. If that's true, and I think it is, it's very interesting when you see what he goes on to do, especially the fact that the iconic, you know, shot of Jimmy Page is him with the black trousers on with the snakes running down the side and the theremin and the twin neck Gibson SG, you know. So he's playing that around about 73. John McLaughlin's playing that around about 72. Who knows, right? How much did the Mavish Orchestra, you know, how much did that influence play on Jimmy Page? It sounds like quite a bit. So anyway, that's who I've got at number 4. Absolutely iconic, Jimmy Page. Right, who's at number 3? It's Eddie Van Halen. What can I say about Eddie Van Halen? Eddie Van Halen is without doubt the architect of modern rock and metal guitar playing. A lot of these guitarists on this list are so important, you know, but a lot of these guitarists on here, the fathers of modern rock guitar, you know, the Jimmy Page, the Ritchie Blackmores, the Angus Youngs, the Tony Iommis, they've come out of that 60s blues boom, as has Eddie Van Halen. But Eddie Van Halen's got a view of guitar playing which is absolutely unique. He's a true pioneer. These are very, very rare. These are people that don't do anything the way they should. They question everything. And I feel that Eddie Van Halen questions the very nature of what the guitar is. He wants to he's going to use lots and lots of different techniques. You know, these techniques are coming out of necessity. He's very famous for, you know, doing tapping, but there was so much more stuff he did on guitar than just tapping. But, you know, he's getting this from guitarists like Alan Holdsworth. Alan Holdsworth's such an incredible technician with his sort of 4-note string per string way of playing. And Eddie Van Halen couldn't play like that, so he adopts a way of tapping. Guitarists had tapped before, you know. I can think of many examples. Steve Hackett on Nursery Crime, he's tapping on Giant Hogweed, I think. But Eddie Van Halen also looks at the way that you use amplifiers, the way you wire amplifiers, the way you build the guitar. He looks at the way the tremolo arm works, the way the wiring works. You know, he puts glues into his pickups to make the pickups a certain way. He changes the pickup. He plays a Strat with a, you know, a humbucker pickup at the bridge. You know, things like locking nuts on guitar, Floyd Rose tremolo arms, pickup wiring, all that stuff he pioneered. A really incredible use of effects, you know, the way he would use delays. You know, I do a trick where I will program in a dotted eighth note repeat delay, and when you play that in a certain way, it sounds like you're playing double the speed you're playing, you know. But the way that Van Halen uses that on the track Cathedral is absolutely incredible, really incredible. All the way through, he is pioneering different ways of playing rock guitar. But Eddie Van Halen, an out-and-out rock band, he never strays out the bounds of being just a fantastic rock band. And with all that experimentation, it's so influential that it just basically lays the groundwork for what's going to happen in guitar afterwards. You know, there's not a guitarist, a rock guitarist, or rock metal guitarist after Eddie Van Halen that is not influenced by Eddie Van Halen in some way. An absolutely incredible player. I think he has gone down in history as being one of the great players. What doesn't get mentioned is his incredible performance on stage. And the thing I always got from Eddie when you watched him playing live, he just seemed to be loving what he was doing. That great big smile on his face. He himself as a character was so powerful. And I'm going to tell you an example of how powerful he was. Can you imagine being in a band like Van Halen and you're the biggest band in the world, and you're about to come out with which is perhaps going to be your biggest album, which is 1984, right? And you decide to write the lead single. This is the single that's going to put this album. Now the album before, which is the album Diver Down, which I absolutely love, but a lot of people hate because it's full of all these dodgy cover versions, which is the record company trying to get a hit record. You know, they did You Really Got Me on the first album, and they want them to do that over and over again. I love the fact of how Eddie approaches those cover versions. That's what I find interesting on that album. I actually felt like with Van Halen, the first album's incredible, Van Halen 2 is incredible, Women and Children First, we start to get into it. It's brilliant, but they are sort of tread the same ground. You know, Fair Warning, which I've got here, is an absolute masterpiece. But with Dive It Down, you see a whole different side of Van Halen, and I'm so glad we've got that. But it wasn't actually that success, so what are you going to do next? Well, what Van Halen did is they came out with a single, Jump. And Jump basically is a single by one of the greatest rock bands of all time, with one of the greatest rock guitarists of all time, where the riff on it is not on guitar. Think about it. Think about how insane that is, and that Eddie Van Halen can pull it off. And not only that, of all the mind-blowing riffs he ever wrote, he's probably his most iconic riff he ever wrote is the keyboard riff off Jump. Unbelievable. And that's a testament to his personality, and that's what makes a great rock guitarist, is their personality and the way that comes through. Who do I have at number 2? Right, at number 2 I have Jeff Beck. Jeff Beck, again, like many of the guitarists on this list now, he's an astonishing guitarist. But for me, Jeff Beck has all the criteria of a great rock guitarist. He has the look, He's got the charisma. He can strike the poses, right? He's got everything in that department. But then when you listen to his guitar playing, it is on another level. And we must remember that Jeff Beck is from that classic period of guitarists. We've been talking about them today. Eric Clapton, Ritchie Blackmore, Jimmy Page, Pete Townshend. They're all from that era. For me, Jeff Beck is the one that takes that sort of rock and roll blues based guitaring, you know, and just pushes it to another level. If you go back to the early Yardbirds recordings, you can hear him really trying to sound like a sitar, trying to sound like Indian music. He's thinking beyond just playing the blues. So many of those guitarists back then, for me, are just scuppered because all they want to do is play the blues, and that has gone on to this day. You know, I've played enough blues bands myself to come to that conclusion. You know, that it's not enough for me to just play the blues. You have to do what Jeff Beck does. Jeff Beck is full of the blues, but it's Jeff Beck's version of the blues. And when you do that, you take it beyond what T-Bone Walker or B.B. King or Freddie King or Albert King were doing. And all those guitarists, because if you go back to what B.B. King was doing, he was doing that too. Absolutely. None of those electric, you know, blues guitarists sound like Robert Johnson. You know, they've taken it and made it their own. It's about personality. And Jeff Beck's got about as much personality as you can get. Do I have to go about what he does on guitar? It's astonishing. It's so virtuoso. But there's everything that Beck does, which is virtuoso on guitar, no one else does. He's created it. Right? If it's the finger picking stuff he's doing, or it's the use of harmonics, or the way he bends harmonics and melodically plays them with the tremolo arm, right? It's absolutely astonishing. Throughout his career, he's played a Strat, he's played a Les Paul, he's played all sorts of different guitars. If you listen to him on the 70s albums like Blow by Blow, his playing is almost completely different to Wired, and Wired is absolutely different to what he's doing on There and Back, and There and Back is completely different to what he's doing on Flash, which is completely, you know, he's reinvented himself. It's not just stock Beck stuff. Everyone thinks that. They think, oh, Jeff Beck does this stuff, and there's iconic Beck stuff. But you go back, it's all different. He is pushing the envelope all the time. And for this channel, there's another thing we've got to mention, right? He is not a composer, right? He plays other people's material. I see him as being a bit like an Ella Fitzgerald or Frank Sinatra. He's a great singer of songs. He's a great player of melodies, right? And he's searched out cutting ways of playing melodies all through his career. He's also he's in the 70s. His search to go beyond rock music, because you've got to remember the Jeff Beck group with Rod Stewart, that laid the groundwork for bands like Led Zeppelin. It's where it happens. You know, it's like. You even get Jeff Beck and John Paul Jones, they're almost coalescing around Jeff Beck with Beck's Bolero and all that stuff there. But he doesn't sit there. He brings the jazz thing in. He becomes a fusion pioneer. He sells millions of fusion albums. He's one of the most important fusion musicians. But we don't mention him in the same breath as Return to Forever or Weather Report or Mahavishnu, because he's so much more than that. The guy is nearly 80 years old and still is pushing the envelope, using dance music, using like world music, electronic music. What can I say about Jeff Beck? This really is, perhaps in terms of rock guitarists, the greatest rock guitarist that has ever lived. I think he's the greatest of them. But he's at number 2. And why is it at number 2? Because you know who's at number 1, don't you? At number 1 we have Jimi Hendrix. Now, I've recently done a whole video on Jimi, and at the end of this you will see a little box come up here which will direct you to me talking about Jimi Hendrix for 20 minutes. So I don't want to really go on about it. Why is he on the list? He is the most iconic. And it's different to Jeff Beck. Jeff Beck, we've got a whole 50 years of stuff to choose from. But Hendrix managed to do all that in 3 years. changed the face of music. He's got a hand in inventing progressive rock. He's got a hand in inventing blues rock. He's got a hand in inventing heavy metal. He's got a massive hand in inventing jazz fusion. He invents funk rock, as far as I'm concerned, right? He pushes the studio. He pushes guitar playing. He pushes performance. What's the greatest performance in rock history? The greatest. There's a strong argument that his performance at Monterey Wild Thing when he sets fire guitar is the greatest performance ever in the history of rock music. I know. And this is the guy that did all this in just a few years. To me, if I was putting together an encyclopedia of rock music, who would I stick on the front of that? Elvis Presley, the Beatles, Jimi Hendrix. If I put those three, I think I cover absolutely everything. What an incredible player. What I haven't talked about Jimi on this channel is what could have been. And I've thought about it a lot. I think a lot of people have, because Jimi's there for such a short time. For us jazz guys, we're very interested because, Jimi was talking to Miles Davis. And he wasn't just talking to Miles Davis. Miles was seeing an artist called Betty Davis at the time who knew Jimi, and she was really, hooking him up with Jimi Hendrix, and it was in not just influencing Miles's music, but he was influencing his clothing and all that sort of stuff. Although John McLaughlin stated that he was the one who, took Miles to watch Jimi at Monterey, which just blew Miles away. Were they going to work together? Well, there's an incredible album by Gil Evans where he plays the music of Jimi Hendrix, and that is, if you want to hear where he could have gone, maybe that's it. I don't know. So many guitarists took his legacy and carried it on. For me, one of the most successful is Robin Trower, but Robin Trower you never get that studio experimentation feeling. You never get the outlandish jazz thing in there. You never get that sort of psychedelic visionary, flying on the back of a butterfly, through a psychedelic landscape thing that Hendrix has got. He's absolutely unique. What could have happened? Would he have gone further down into jazz fusion, and that would have been his genre, and we would be discussing that now? Would he have become more political, more experimental, or like Clapton, would he have just turned into, sort of a middle of the road, artist singing songs for housewives? Who knows? That is my video on the 10 greatest rock guitar gods of all time. If you liked it, please like my video. If you want to know more and be notified of these videos I do, please hit subscribe. Most importantly, put a comment in the comments down below. If you want to put a nasty comment in, I may put a nasty comment back, and we can have a nice nasty comment interaction, which I'm finding I'm doing more and more. My mum always used to say, if you've got nothing good to say nothing at all. But some people seem to want to voice the fact that I haven't included Randy Rhoads on the list. Where's Randy Rhoads? You're an idiot. If you don't understand that Randy Rhoads did this, blah, 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 Where's Dimebag Darrell? Dimebag Darrell represents, and these are guitarists that I have agonised over this week, at least for a few minutes, whether they should go on my list. But they were two. Randy Rhoads I thought should go on there, Dimebag Darrell should go on there, and then there's a whole bunch of eights. Joe Satriani, I love Joe Satriani, should he be on here? But how iconic is Joe Satriani? He's never played in a rock band, it's all instrumental stuff. He did try and sing at one point, and he shouldn't really have done that, really. But I do love Joe Satriani. There's so many guitarists I love, Maybe what I need to do next is have a look at those 80s guitarists. And then once we've done the 80s guitarists, there's all those 90s rock guitarists that sort of, there's a little bit of punk in there. I'm thinking of people like Dimebag. I'm thinking of people like Kim Thal from Soundgarden. Who else would there be in that? Tom Morello. Tom Morello nearly made my list. There's a whole bunch of other guitarists. People like, Thurston Moore from Sonic Youth, Tom Verlaine, you know, The Edge. You know, there's so many incredible guitar players out there I would love to talk about on this channel. When I do these lists, you have to understand, I want to explore a certain area, and I think rock guitar gods are maligned by the mainstream. You know, I'm sure there's, you know, the average music critic will want to champion, you know, what a great guitarist Neil Young is with his sort of authentic, you know, guitar playing, where it is ripped for his soul. You know, all this technique and chops that just sublimates the feel. You can't truly convey a feel unless it's authentic and there's no technique there. What a load of rubbish! Oh! God, it does my head in. That really does my head in. You know, in nowhere else. You know, if you were carving a piece of wood and you wanted to express something in that wood, you want to express a horse leaping, and so someone would get the feel. You know, for someone to come along and say, well, you'll do that, you'd be so much better if you had no skill at carving, right? There are musicians who are able, through their personal vision, to express something deeply emotional without chops and technique. But the idea that having it stops you from doing that is absolutely ridiculous. And so what we get in mainstream music criticism so often is this idea that people who can play, like Jeff Beck or Ritchie Blackmore or Jimi Page or Angus Young or Tony Iommi, we're going to push to the background and push forth people who are authentic. And the guy on this list that suffered the worst for that is Ritchie Blackmore. Ritchie Blackmore doesn't even get mentioned in the same breath as someone like Eric Clapton or Jimi Hendrix, and he should. He's there from the 1960s, and he's a true pioneer. If you're watching this, Ritchie, and I'm sure you're not, we love you. You are the man. And everybody knows it. All us musicians know it, really. We know it. Amount of guitarists that I've met who absolutely worship Ritchie Blackmore. Without Ritchie Blackmore, there's no Steve Vai. Without Ritchie Blackmore, there's no Yngwie Malmsteen. There's no Joe Satriani. There's no Scott Henderson. Right? These people need to be mentioned on this list, and that's why I do these videos. Right? Before I go, Neil Young is a great artist. I'm not knocking him. I'm using an example of the critics' darling. That's what I'm doing. There's a whole host of these people. Iggy Pop and the Stooges are the one. Stooges never made a great album, but they'll still be put in the list of great albums, you know, because the critics love them, right? I love Iggy Pop. He's great, right? But we have to redress the balance, right? And when you meet musicians like Iggy Pop, you know, it's like I was watching an interview the other day with, I think, Glenn Matlock from the Sex Pistols. And he says, do you listen to much punk and the Sex Pistols? And he goes, no, not really. I like to listen to Steely Dan. Of course he does. He spent a lifetime doing music. He knows where the music is, like everybody else. Right? They're a joke. That line that's pushed by music critics, which has now got into the media, is absolutely everywhere. I hear my students say it to me. I've had a battle with my students this week. Rock guitarists saying, they don't need to learn this stuff. It will stop them playing their field. You know, absolute nonsense. Anyway, I am, if you've noticed, I am taking these videos and going into a rant. This rant is, you get the special feature rant at the end. You've got one today. I wasn't actually planning on doing it, but I've done another rant today. I haven't ended up, you know, talking about biscuits. I could talk about something random. But you can't do this unless it happens. It happens. Oh my God, though. All I have to do is look. All I have to do, and as I look over here, I'll just go over here and sat on the floor, just lying there, because this room's an absolute tip, you know. I angle the camera at my, you know, the rest of it is an absolute tip, and sat lying on the floor, which is a box of these 5 mini Battenbergs. I am a big fan of the Battenberg, right? And if I was to do cakes, the Battenberg would rank very highly. So for those of you who do like to know these additional facts about my eating, you know, habits and other things that I like, you know, this video has been brought to you by Mr. Kipling's Mini Battenberg. The Mini Battenberg is not as good as the proper full-size Battenberg, you know, but they're portable, you know. It's like a portable Battenberg. And everybody needs a portable Battenberg cake at some point, you know. You can't go walking down the road chewing away on a great big Battenberg cake, can you? If you cut it into slices, where are you going to store those slices? So I appreciate what Mr. Kipling's done with those. But yeah, now you're happy now? See, I can do it that easy, you know. Classic album review, Rick Beato, Sea of Tranquility. You don't get that in this, you know. You know why? Because they're sensible people and they can stick to the topic. I can't. And there we are. That's where I know my video is finished when we get to this point. I'll see you on the next one. Thanks for watching.